Kamla. My guest today is Jonathan Kaufman. He is a food writer for San Francisco Chronicle, and he is a cook as well as an author. His first book is called Hippie Food: How Back to the Landers, Long Hairs and Revolutionaries Change the Way We Eat. This is the copy of Jonathan's book. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Food.
Yes.
You're consumed by food.
I really am. I think about it every day.
Really?
Yeah.
So, well, then you are an uncommon American, right? Because you think about cooking food.
I do, yeah.
Right? That's why I said uncommon American, right? What are your earliest memories of food?
I remember, one of the things that I remember the most is pizza night my parents would have every Saturday, where my mom would make dough herself and let it rise, and then we'd stand around and sort of put on our toppings, the toppings we wanted, and then it would come out of the oven 20 minutes later. But I also remember things like the sweets that she allowed us to have while I was a young child, when she was really she did not want to have sugar in our diets, but we were allowed as much honey.
Was she a fan of Gloria Swanson?
No.
Why is it she didn't want sugar?
There was this beginning. They were really beginning to understand that sugar had all of these effects on metabolism and mood, but they didn't necessarily have the science down to understand why or what was happening. So there was a big movement in the 70s especially among folks who were really interested in whole foods, to rid the kitchen of...
Not the grocery store.
Right. No, not the grocery. Right. They weren't going to even shop at the grocery store if they can get away with it.
Oh, where would they shop?
At food co-ops and natural food stores. And at that time, most of them would not carry sugar. And they would, in fact, many people told me there were these huge arguments that would erupt anytime they considered the idea of putting sugar on the shelves.
So the reference to Gloria Swanson was because she didn't believe in sugar.
Right. She and her husband, William Duffy, were big anti-sugar crusaders.
And macrobiotic.
As well, yeah.
Yeah. So what is macrobiotic diet?
So macrobiotics was this, it was both a philosophy and a diet that was developed or introduced by this man named George Osawa. He was a Japanese man who had been part of a movement in Japan in the early part of the 20th century to bring Japanese diets back to pre-Western contact, so to advocating the health effects of a Japanese peasant diet. So he combined that with...
That's not the Okinawa diet?
No.
Okay.
Well, actually, the Okinawa diet would have been very much in line with George Osawa and macrobiotics.
Okay.
But he was advocating brown rice at a time when Japanese had stopped eating brown rice. That was poor people food. That was peasant food. So he combined that with his own understanding of what yin and yang were, and applied those to foods. He grafted them onto foods in a way that was very different from the way that Chinese traditionally do. And he took this diet all over Europe and North America and introduced it to people in 1960. And he had this theory that he would argue that the American diet is leading to diabetes and cancer and heart disease. All of these things are, that we now know are true, but nobody was arguing at the same time. But he was also saying that smoking is good, and if you really want to change all of the all the cells in your body, if you want to just regenerate yourself, you needed to eat a brown rice diet for 10 days. So
was there any truth to that?
Not that I know of, but I did talk to a lot of people who did the 10 days on brown rice, and they said that they would end up with this sort of spiritual high, and then some of them took it so far they got scurvy.
Oh, because of lack of vitamin B?
Yeah, vitamin C.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay, so there was a downside to it.
Right.
Okay.
But the counterculture really picked up macrobiotics in the late 60s because it was the first...
It was not Gwyneth Paltrow then?
No. Although she does write about it. She mentions macrobiotics and macrobiotics.
Because she's famous. She's the one who's big into macrobiotics, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so we think these are all new things, but they actually are 40, 50 years old.
Yeah.
And that's what you explore in the book, Hippie Food, is how this whole organic food movement started, the movement to eat tofu, brown rice, farmers market, all these things that we now look forward to every Saturday and Sunday. Go to the farmers market, How did the idea for the book come?
It came about because I had never paid much attention to what I call hippie food. I mean, it was something I grew up around, and then as a college
Your parents were
student,
hippies?
They weren't hippies. They were Mennonites, but they were living in northern Indiana, but they were liberal Mennonites, and so we were eating a lot of these foods.
Why?
It was out of a desire to, I think, avoid chemicals and pesticides in the food. There were a lot of scandals that had, were breaking in the news, and Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring about the dangers of DDT had come out, and so there was this real fear of what we were doing to our environment and also to our bodies with all the additives and coloring and flavorings that had been introduced into the American diet in the 1940s and 50s.
So your parents were very aware.
They were.
But what about this book?
And so this book, More with Less Cookbook, it came out in the Mennonite press specifically for Mennonites, and you applied a lot of this understanding of how we should be eating with whole foods, and combined it with recipes from Mennonites who had been doing relief work around the world. So there are dishes that are inspired by Latin America, India, Africa.
I can't even find the first page. You have so many.
It's become my recipe box, so I have a lot of attachment to it.
I can see it.
Yeah.
It's just your walking recipe box. Do you still use it?
I do for making for breads. There are certain breads that my mom used to bake that I still love baking.
So this was the book that influenced your family.
It really was.
So More with Less.
Yep.
And that put you in the hippie path, the
Yeah.
hippie food path.
Yeah.
I mean, I say it nicely.
Yeah.
I mean, in the sense that they were so aware of eating food that was clean and wholesome. And then what happened? So
I became a restaurant critic. I trained as a chef, training in French restaurants. I moved beyond this food.
So you were eating a lot of dairy stuff if you were in the French show.
Oh yeah, a lot of butter.
Okay.
And then it
was that a rebellious act? Because this had no butter or very little butter?
I think appreciating sort of the hedonism of fine food was a bit of a rebellion.
You wanted to be a lotus eater.
Yeah. Definitely.
Okay, so you went the hedonistic path. Okay, and then how did you swing back then?
Well, I was a restaurant critic for many years, but I was in Seattle about 10 years ago, and I used to review restaurants of all different kinds. I just did like to keep it varied and write about the entire restaurant scene. And I visited this restaurant, this 30-year-old vegetarian restaurant with some friends of mine called Sunlight Cafe.
Oh, so the sun really shone.
Yeah, occasionally. They're ready for it when it does.
Okay.
And we had steamed vegetables and tahini sauce, and we had like nut loaves, and everybody around the table who grew up in the 70s, we just had this big hit of nostalgia, and I realized that this food was disappearing.
Ah.
And I wanted to write more about it before it disappeared, but I also suddenly wondered, like, well, where did it come from? And if I think
this
about
book.
Yeah. How did this happen in small town in Indiana in the 70s? So that was the question that started
Back
it
to
out.
the future.
Yeah.
So you started exploring. How long did it take for you to write this book?
It took me about 5 years, mostly because I was doing it on the side of having a full-time job.
Yeah, it shows, because this was like a little rabbit hole. I was like Alice, I was going to different rabbit holes. And, okay, Tassajara bread book, what is it about? So I went and read up on that, I was reading up on Vermont, farmers market, I spent more time looking up.
That's great.
So I can imagine that you must have left out quite a bit.
Oh, yes. Well, and I just, for each chapter, I wanted to focus on a different part of the country. To make sure to give the sense to people that this was really a grassroots nationwide movement.
So the first chapter is fruit, seeds, and health nuts, and that's Southern California. So where you look at the whole food movement or the
health food movement, they called them food faddists.
Oh, yeah. So this started in the 1930s in Southern California.
Yeah.
Okay, then you went to brown rice and macrobiotic, which is, we talked about the Japanese gentleman who brought it here. And brown bread and the pursuit of wholeness. Tell us about that, the third chapter.
So because whole wheat bread was such an iconic food for the counterculture, what turned out, what was fascinating to me was that actually had the deepest roots in an American critique of industrialized food. Sylvester Graham, who we know from graham crackers, even though he didn't invent graham crackers.
Oh.
They had a graham flour.
What is graham flour?
It's a sort of a coarse whole grain, whole wheat flour.
Okay.
So he lived in the 1830s, and he was America's first vegetarian crusader.
Oh.
And he also believed that if we're stripping all of the bran out of our bread, we're taking away what makes it healthy. He had some kind of funny ideas about why that was.
He was not Seventh-day Adventist.
The Seventh-day Adventists were inspired by him.
Oh.
So it was just looking at this old critique of milling and nutrients and and meat eating, and seeing how 130 years later, counterculture kids were picking up the exact same argument, only with just sort of a more modern twist.
So the graham cracker gentleman, I mean, he didn't invent the cracker, but he was the first vegetarian in America?
I wouldn't call him the first vegetarian, but certainly the first vegetarian advocate, and he spoke all around the East Coast. He was
Which part of the country was he
influential.
from?
I think Massachusetts, definitely New England.
Oh, New England, okay. And then the Seventh-day Adventists, they, you say, were the, what did you call them? The standard bearers for vegetarian food in USA was the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and that was kind of a surprising thing. I did not know that.
Yeah. Well, because they started becoming vegetarians, at a time when food was so much more simple. Their food is very plain, very few spices. They also invented a lot of the early meat substitutes. Like Protos and Nuttolene. Some of them were invented by Kellogg, who himself, and they were canned or processed. So they didn't necessarily, the counterculture kids who wanted everything to be natural and fresh and raw didn't pick up on them. But these foods were around for 150 years, and I have a cookbook from 1915 it's a vegetarian cookbook.
Oh, really?
So, yeah.
So not everybody was following Joy of Cooking?
No. No.
Okay. So it looks like Massachusetts played a key role, because Joy of Cooking is also from Massachusetts, if I remember right, right? The East Coast.
I'm not sure. Yeah.
I think so. I could be wrong. This image popped up in my head because there was a documentary that I saw on Joy of Cooking. Anyway, we veered off. Vegetarian on the curry trail. Now that I know, because many of them came to South Asia. And you link that with this money that the airlines were spending. You say that between 1965 and 75, $14 billion in money of those times was spent on acquiring huge jumbo jets and jets. And that opened up this cheap airfare war, cheap air ticket war. And that meant a lot of people went to different parts of the world, Europe and Asia.
Yeah.
So what did they bring back, the vegetarians on the curry trail? What did they bring back?
I think one of the things they brought back was this love for French food. Even the folks who went to Europe, like Alice Waters, it really changed their idea of what
so she
vegetables
also
could
went
be.
during this time.
She didn't go to Asia, but she definitely went to Europe. There were middle-class kids. It was cheap enough for them to go to Europe for the summer for the first time, and then many more of them went overland. They would they would be part of a caravan, or they would go and buy a motorcycle, and they would take the overland trail through Turkey and Central Asia, through Iran to India.
Unthinkable today.
Right, I know. Yeah.
So they went on the old Silk Route.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I think they because they were poor, most of these college kids or dropouts, they weren't staying in hotels eating continental cuisine. They were really they were going to be eating the food that was around them. And so I think they picked up this exposure to flavors and ingredients through just direct contact that middle class travelers wouldn't have had.
So who are some of the biggest cross pollinators in this curry trail? In terms of people?
In terms of people. When you get to this part of the history, there aren't major figures because it became this rush of folks, and so it was just influencing everybody through word of mouth. And so, everybody was doing everything collectively and sharing information, and nobody could pinpoint point where
I was thinking that you would say Santana's wife.
Oh.
because you cover San Francisco, and so she opened a restaurant, didn't she?
She did, yeah. So Carlos Santana met his wife at one of the first vegetarian restaurants that kind of got hip, called the Shandy Gaff. They met at the communal table.
You interviewed the gentleman who...
The gentleman who founded the restaurant. And
that was on Polk Street?
Yeah. And then she opened her own restaurant on Church and Market called Dipti Nevis, and it was around for many years. Everybody I know who lived in San Francisco in the 1970s remembers it.
Oh, okay. So the other person that was involved with that Polk Street Cafe is Molly Katzen.
Yeah. So Molly Katzen grew up in right, and she came to San Francisco to go to the Art Institute and stumbled on Shandy Gaff, and she had worked in a macrobiotic cafe and thought the food was too bland. So she loved what they were doing at the Shandy Gaff, which was they had organic vegetables, it was very colorful, it was light, it was hip, and she took that sort of sensibility to Ithaca when she and her brother and some friends opened up a collectively run restaurant called Moosewood Cafe.
Okay, so that was... So who is the gentleman associated with the Shandy Gaff?
His name's Ruben Glickman. He's 83. He still lives in San Francisco, and he still runs every day.
He runs?
Yep.
And he still eats the vegetarian food?
He does.
Okay, so that is, then the food co-op social revolution and the birth of an industry, that was fascinating because you talk about Austin, Texas, and the birth of Whole Foods, which is now part of Amazon.
Yeah.
Did you include that in your book?
No, that was too late. In fact, I just sort of focused on the opening of Whole Foods and didn't talk about anything after that. I figured the founding of Whole Foods and the election of Ronald Reagan were a good endpoint to this decade that I had really covered.
Okay. Why do you think Austin became a nerve center for this food co-ops?
I think because of the University of Texas is a big, all the college towns.
I thought you were going to say because of the Marxists there.
No.
Because didn't they have, oh no, that was the River Cafe in Minnesota.
Yeah, New Riverside Cafe in Minneapolis, right, had the Marxists.
They had the Marxist thing. So I derailed your argument.
So, I mean, all of the college towns became centers for counterculture kids, and then by extension, their ideas about food. And so you find a lot of co-ops and other food businesses in college towns across the country.
Okay.
So Austin, they told me, was this sort of the easygoing, politically aware, politically active, but also, you know, rock and roll lifestyle kind of town that would attract counterculture kids from all over the country who would come during the winter because it was a warm place to be.
Got you. So it had that makings, that there were people that would take to it naturally. So this is broadly, you know, we talked about how this movement emerged in different parts of the country. But if you go down and look at some of the companies that were established, like for instance, Stonyfield.
Yeah.
That was in Vermont. Vermont was a very interesting study, wasn't it?
It really was, because, and the reason I was drawn to write about Vermont and the back to the landers and communes there was because the state underwent a radical change during that period. So many kids and homesteaders moved to Vermont during the 1970s that it changed the political orientation of the state, the social direction of the state, even though it retained a much more rural feel to it.
So, and then Stonyfield has now been acquired by a French yogurt company, right? So does it strike you as being ironic that all these small companies that were looking for clean food, wholesome food, eventually got co-opted by the bigger corporations?
Yeah, it does. Because I think, you know, so much of the motivation for people during that time was anti-capitalist. They wanted small is beautiful, which was a huge manifesto during that time, and people felt like they wanted to have small local economies. They wanted to, you know, change capitalism. But because they couldn't overthrow capitalism, then the companies that survived had to adapt, and the ones who grew then ended up becoming subject to all the pressures that affect corporations of all kinds.
Okay. And then there was another interesting tidbit in the book, food conspiracy.
So
That was very interesting. What did they do?
it's a glorified, lefty name for a buying club.
Oh.
But because they didn't want to be called co-ops and they didn't want to be called buying clubs because that sounded too capitalist, they adopted the word food conspiracy, in honor of the Chicago trials of, conspiracy trials.
Oh,
so all they would do is you would get groups of communes and households who would buy food together. They would like load up a VW van at the farmer's market and bring that back, and somebody else would go buy 100-pound sacks of flour, and somebody else would buy big wheels of cheese, and they'd get together, divvy it up, and that way they could make their dollars stretch.
Was that forbidden to buy in bulk?
It wasn't forbidden, but I don't think anybody was doing it.
Got you. So when we come to San Francisco, for some reason I thought this was a book about, when I saw the title, and then when I started reading, I realized it's about the whole country, actually, how these different movements came and they got integrated. But San Francisco has left its own mark.
Definitely.
Talk to us about the Tassajara bread book. The Tassajara bread book, which spawned Acme and all the other artisanal bakeries that we've come to associate with when we, for those of us who live in the Bay Area.
Yeah, so the San Francisco Zen Center, which was founded in the 60s, in the late 60s, early 70s, decided it wanted to have a rural monastery. And so a young Zen monk named Edward S.B. Brown, he went to the Tassajara Resort, which is southeast
Monterey.
of yeah, exactly, and he worked there for a season while they kind of explored areas around there that they might want to buy. The monks.
The monks.
And he began baking bread there, working under the cooks who were already there at the restaurant, and discovered that he really loved it. And they were making whole grain bread, and once the Zen Center bought Tassajara, he stayed on as the Tenzo, the monastery cook. And they would take in guests, and so he was baking 24 loaves of this bread a day and then teaching all of these Zen students and then guests how to make it. And he really realized that there wasn't a baking book that taught what he had learned in person, like how bread dough feels or should feel, what it looks like when it rises, how it smells. And so he used this method that he'd been taught, and then came up with all these variations and just sort of wrote it down and did some hand drawings and took it to a Buddhist publisher in Berkeley called Shambhala, and they decided to publish it, and it became a runaway success.
And still is a success?
And it still is selling, yeah. And the bread is still really good. I made some for a reading 3 months ago, and everybody was like, because
why is it good? What is different about their?
Part of it is because the recipe is really simple and it's reliable, because it's a two-stage method of making the bread, the rise. You make a sponge and then you sort of let it rise a second time, which is not how most recipes in America were written at the time. And he also incorporates up to a cup of dried milk, which gives it this really rich...
like milk powder?
Yeah, which gives it this rich sweetness.
Can you delete the milk powder and still make the bread?
I use it. Yeah, you can. It's not going to be quite as rich. I use half the milk powder.
Oh,
and
okay.
I get good results. So.
Oh, okay. So that's at the Tassa, and he went on to be involved with the Green's Restaurant.
He did, yeah.
In San Francisco.
Right.
Which is one of the oldest vegetarian restaurants.
Yeah, and that opened in 1979.
And still going strong.
It is. Yeah.
Okay. Now, when we fast forward to the 21st century, we find that the food that was popular in the 60s and 70s is back in fashion, but in a whole different way.
Yeah.
Right? You get these rice bowls, and I'm always stunned. They're a little bit of brown rice, they have veggies shredded and all very artfully arranged, and you're shelling out $12.
Right. Well, and sprouts are back, and legume dishes, smoothies are back, juicing is sort of hot, and they're even picking up some of those ingredients that were part of the 1970s that everybody had forgotten about, like nutritional yeast. So I enjoy it. I'm glad to see people playing with those flavors, but it's also a lot tastier than it was back then as well. So.
Why do you think it is a lot tastier? Is it because a lot more people have contributed and changed the recipes?
And I think that the availability of products that they can buy is so much greater. The vegetables are fresher, they're brighter. They also I think that we've absorbed the lessons of high-end cooking, and so people have really become more sophisticated cooks, especially cookbook authors and people who want to write these glamorous recipes. And so I think there are more steps in all of the recipes.
So it's not opaque.
Right.
It's more transparent. My final question is going to be a policy-related one, because throughout the book you talk about how these different co-ops and companies or farmers market or whatever came about, but there were policy pushbacks. Mm-hmm. There were pushbacks from USDA and others, like the Harvard guy that you mentioned, who was very critical of the macrobiotic diet. Mm-hmm. But the same Harvard department, I think, went on after 20 years to say this is a very good diet for you to follow. Mm-hmm. So what changes have you seen in the policy?
Right. Well, back in the 1960s and 70s, the attitude was, well, if you eat your four square meal, or if you eat 3 square meals, and you eat, you've got your dairy, your meat, your vegetables, and I forget the 4 food groups. And they also said that sugar was fine and processed chemicals were fine. And what really came to happen as we did more research, as nutritional science got more sophisticated, and especially after they discovered the benefits of fiber, is academic nutritionists and people connected to the USDA just realized how much healthier the natural foods diet was. And so they've embraced that it's part of the food pyramid now. It's part of the nutritional guidelines for school food. The food that school kids are eating is really indistinguishable sometimes from hippie food of 1975.
Yeah, and there's revolution food. We have run out of time, but otherwise, that's the revolution food is in Oakland, mm-hmm. where they serve new hippie food.
Yeah, pretty much. I don't think they'd be thrilled with me calling it that, but it is.
But this is food that's rich in fiber, it's got veggies, and it's got less of processed stuff?
Yep.
Okay, so there's change happening.
Yeah.
How happy are you?
I'm happy to see it, yeah.
And how happy are you with the book?
I'm so glad it's out. Although I have to say, it was the most fun. It was the most fun I've had working on a big project. I just love talking to everybody.
Yes. Thank you so much, Jonathan. It was such a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back again next week with another edition of our show. If you missed any of our shows, you can catch them on our YouTube channel or visit our website. Until next week, goodbye.